Well, terrific. Good to be back with you again. This topic tonight is one of my favorite topics, and the reason why is because it is so pivotal. Now, last night we pretty much confronted the man, Muhammad. Tonight we're going to confront the book. Last night, remember at the very beginning, I mentioned that in order to understand Islam, you really need to really understand two things. The two things that hold up Islam is one book, the Quran, and one man, Muhammad. Conversely, the same thing exists for us as Christians. Remember I said that last night, that for us to understand who we are, we also follow a book modeled by a man, but not the same book, not the same man. Ours is the Bible, the man is Jesus Christ. Now, since these are the foundations for both faiths, and since we understand our book better than anybody else, we can therefore understand why the Quran is so powerful for Islam, why it's so foundational, and why and where it gets its authority from. You walk out these doors and you talk to almost anybody else, and they will not understand that as much as you do. And that's why we're focusing on these two areas. Last night we did a historical survey looking at the emergence of Islam. We asked an awful lot of questions concerning not only the fact that there's just nothing there for us to look at, but that when it finally is written down, it's written down so late, 200 to 300 years later. Not from the 7th century when it should have been written down. It was being written down in the 9th and 10th century. Then we looked and asked, well, what is and why do you think this happened? And we then found out that had an awful lot to do with politics. It had nothing at all to do with theology, and it certainly had nothing to do with a man named Muhammad. And that was very clear that Islam really did not come from Muhammad, nor did the book, the Quran, come from Muhammad. And we're going to see that today. But we need to come to those conclusions, and we've got to do that by walking through and asking, how is it and where are we going to find this book? Now let's look at their claims. I'm going to start with the claims the Muslims make, like I did last night. And there really are 4 claims. These are the 4 claims that you can learn, memorize, just memorize those blue words. Number 1, that the Quran has always been. It is uncreated. It is the uncreated book that exists on tablets that exist in heaven. That's internal to the Quran itself. In chapter 85, verse 22, you have that claim. So it's uncreated. Therefore, it has no human intervention. Number 2, that the references or those surahs that came from those tablets were sent down piecemeal by the angel Gabriel to a man named Muhammad over a 22-year period from 610 to 632. Uncreated, sent down. Number 3, that the Quran was not completed during Muhammad's lifetime. There was no Quran when Muhammad died, according to Islamic tradition, according to the Muslims. It was not in any codex, in any codice form. It was not written down in one manuscript. It was memorized by many of the companions of Muhammad. It was certainly written, parts of it were written on stones and bones and leaves, but had not yet been written down in a book form like I have here. And then number 4, that when it was finally written down at the time of Uthman, 652, the 3rd caliph, that book that was written by him is exactly the same that I have in my hand today. This is known as the Hafs text. This is the canonical text. This is the text we're looking at, not the English part, the Arabic part. Now, if you're going to get a Quran, try to get one like this, one that has both Arabic and English, because much of what I'm going to say tonight and much of what I say up on the internet at Fander Films, I will be quoting verse after verse after verse. Most of the Muslims that you meet have not read those verses. The vast majority of Muslims do not read the Quran like you read the Bible. And the reason is very simple. Muslims only read the Quran to memorize it, to receive barakah, that's to receive blessing that's recorded by an angel sitting on their right shoulder, given to them when they were born. Another angel that sits on this shoulder records their bad deeds. It's very much like a bank account, credit and debit, credit and debit. So to retain that, or to get that credit, you have got to read the Quran, and you have to read it in Arabic. Now, only 15% of all Muslims worldwide speak Arabic. 85% do not know Arabic. And the vast majority of Muslims in this country do not know Arabic. So they're not going to know much of what I'm going to say tonight, and they're not going to know much of what you're going to claim, and not many of the references that you go to, they will have never heard. So keep a Quran with you. More than likely, almost every Muslim you will speak will not have a Quran with them. Isn't that so, Sarah? When we go to Speaker's Corner, how many Muslims have Qurans in their hands? Zilch. They all have Bibles in their hands, God bless them, and they have all these little post-it notes all the way through with seeming contradictions and seeming errors, seeming what they call scientific problems, but there is no one that has a Quran in their hands because they don't use the Quran to understand it. They don't use it to read it and assimilate it and then to apply it to their lives unless they're radical Muslims over here on the right. The vast majority of Muslims are not radicals. They're usually nominal or liberal. So for that reason, be aware of the fact that much of the material that you're going to learn, not just tonight, but also up on the internet, much of this material you will know, they won't. Let's then get back to this question. So if those are the four claims, that the Quran is eternal, that it was sent down to a man named Muhammad over a 22-year period, that it was codified and finalized, canonized there in 652 AD during the reign of the third caliph Uthman, and that it has never changed, can you see that's quite a mouthful right there, those four. Would we ever say that about our Bible? Absolutely not, and please don't do that. We do not believe our Bible is uncreated. We know the Bible was created. We know who wrote it. We know when they wrote it. We put their names to many of the books that they wrote. It was written by men, inspired by God, but not written by God, and certainly not eternal. So don't make that claim about the Bible. Secondly, our Bible was not sent down. We don't know of any angel that brought portions of it over a 22-year period to anybody. Every one of the books was written by different men. 33 different men in 3 different continents over 1,500 years. And that's why we would never make these two first claims. Thirdly, we would make the claim that it was complete at one time. But we don't have any of the original manuscripts, so therefore we would not assume today that we could go back to those complete manuscripts, because for one very simple reason, they were written on papyrus, those interlocking leaves. And as you well know, papyrus disintegrates within 100 years. None of the manuscripts we're going to look at today by the Muslims, or the Quranic manuscripts, are written on papyrus. They're all written on parchment or vellum. That means animal skin. Two completely different modes of writing. Ours are written on papyrus. It's not that they didn't have vellum in the first century. It was very expensive to use vellum, to use animal skin. And Christianity was birthed in poverty. And for the first 300 years remained in poverty until Constantine then, as the emperor, converted to Christianity and made it the state religion. So don't expect that we're talking about the same things with the Bible. We do not make these claims. We do not have the originals. Changes? Yes, we would admit that there have been many changes in the Bible. We even inform the reader about them. So when you open up Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 20, at least in my Bible, there's a line warning the readers that these verses are not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts. John chapter 7, verse 53 to John chapter 8, verse 11, the story of the woman caught in adultery. These verses are not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts. 1 John chapter 5, verse 7, we warn the readers that these aren't even found in the later manuscripts. These were introduced possibly in the 15th century, just that one verse. So we are very open, we are very transparent. We would say the Bible has been changed, but the reason why we still keep those verses in there is because we know that they do not introduce any new doctrine that's not found elsewhere. Okay, so be careful. Don't make these 4 claims about the Bible. Please don't. Thank God we don't make these 4 claims. But the Muslims do. And that's why we need to investigate that. Now tonight, I cannot critique uncreatedness or eternality. I cannot create sent down because I'm not in the 7th century and I'm not up in heaven. There's no way I could ever look to see if that tablet is there. So what I'm going to do is critique the last 2 of those 4. We can demand One manuscript, and this is what I'm going to demand, and you can demand this as well. All I'm looking for is one manuscript, complete manuscript, from the mid-7th century, that means from 652, which is complete, that means has all 114 books, or all 114 surahs, and has never been changed. Now, that's not too much to ask, is it? The reason why I'm asking that and demanding is because they claim it. And you're going to see a little video where that claim is made, and you'll hear every Muslim claim that they can go back to theirs is the only scripture that can be traced right back to its original source on earth. And you'll hear almost every Muslim I've met. And for 40 years of working with Muslims, when I first came here, when I first started coming here to Britain back in 1992, they were claiming, what was it, about 100,000 manuscripts at that time? Remember that, Judy? 100,000 manuscripts that they could point to that came from the time of Uthman. We started confronting these. They then moved back to about 10,000 manuscripts. Then by about 2002, they moved back to 1,000 manuscripts. By 2014, when I did my debate with Shabir Ali there in Toronto on the 6 major manuscripts, they then moved back to those 6 manuscripts. So from 100,000 down to 1,000, down to 6 manuscripts in 2014. Now with this new material that I'm introducing tonight, and you'll see why, they've really now only reduced themselves down to 1 manuscript, the Topkapi. Ooh, I love that. Makes my job. Isn't that been great, Sarah, how we forced them back? But even that 1 manuscript we're going to put on the hot seat tonight. So this is all I'm going to do tonight. So I'm going to do 12 different areas. Hold on. We're going to go through 12 areas of historical criticism. The first one I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what the Muslim leaders used to say. I'm looking at then what the Muslim scholars now today say. I'm going to look at some historical anachronism. We're going to go into what we call source criticism. We'll look at the first two compilations of the Quran. Then we'll look at the 6 earliest manuscripts. We'll look at the 2 layers of the Sana'a manuscript, the most exciting amongst them. We'll look at the 4 carbon dating lab reports, take a swipe through the late diacritical variants, ask the question about where is that first earliest extant Quran, and then end up with the early consonantal variants and end up with the history of the 1924 Hafs canonized text. 12 areas. Put your pen down. You're not going to keep up with me. That's why we're filming this, so it's going to be on YouTube. It's going to be on KT Online. It's also be on Fander Films, so you can look at it and take your time and unpack it. We're going to take everything that's on the screen will be embedded into the film that we're going to put up online. So let's start with the very first one. What do modern Muslim scholars, what do they claim today? Let's start with Suzanne Hanif, who is a convert to Islam. She says that it is preserved today in its exact original form. Okay, so she's a convert. Maybe she doesn't know better. Well, let's ask Fethullah Gulen. Fethullah Gulen, who is part of the Gulen movement out of Turkey, he lives in Pennsylvania now. He and Erdogan used to be co-scholars together before Erdogan then and he separated. He says one Quran unaltered, unedited, and untampered. Okay? What about Abdullah Yusuf Ali? Abdullah Yusuf Ali is probably the most respected translator of the Quran into the English language, did his translation in the 1930s. He said, not a single letter has changed. This is in 1935 he said this. Not a single letter has changed. So what we have in our hand today, this book right here, is exactly the same that was which was revealed to Muhammad and then compiled by Uthman. Maulvi Muhammad Ali, who is part of the Ahmadi movement, he goes even further. He says not even a diacritical point has been changed. When you look at the Arabic script, you will see that there are dots above and below the line. We'll explain these. Those are diacritical points. Anytime you see a dot, to make it a nun or a ta or a tha or a ba or a ya, that is those dots create the letters, then separate the letters. Those are called diacritical points. So he's saying even the dots are exactly the same today as they have always been, that exist there in heaven, sent down to Muhammad, and then compiled by Uthman. Dr. Shabir Ali, a good friend of mine, I've debated him 6 different times. He will not debate me anymore for obvious reasons. He used to say that they were exactly identical for over 1,300 years. He said, folks, that's 1,300 years ago, and we can compare that with what we're reading today, and we find them to be exactly identical. He goes on to say, and then he actually got a little bit more wiser as he went on. He says, the text was known through memory work and through the written materials handed down right from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. As I said, the two copies that were made 1,400 years ago. So then he went to 1,400 years, making it even earlier. One which is in Tashkent, Russia. Well, he doesn't know his geography. Tashkent's not in Russia. For example, has been demonstrated by Ahmad von Defert in his book Ulum al-Quran to be an early copy from that time, and we find no difference from that copy to what we're reading today. That's the Samarkand manuscript, which is in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, not Russia. Well, look at that today. So, conclusions? These are their conclusions, that the Quran we have today has not changed one iota since its inception 1,400 years ago. 2, that the Quran we have today is exactly the same as that which is on the preserved tablets in heaven. And 3, that our Quran parallels in every detail that which was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad and was written down completely by Uthman in 652 AD. But is that what the earliest Muslim scholars believed? Let's look at what they said concerning the Quran. So I've just given you what the modern Muslim scholars say. Let's see what the earliest one said. Now here you have Ibn Abi Dawud. He says that some verses were lost. The Quran that was sent down were known by those who died in the day of Yama, but they were not known by those who survived them, nor were they written down, nor were they found with even one person after them. That's not the same as what I'm hearing scholars today say. Here you have As-Suyuti, who's writing, it is reported from Ismail ibn Ibrahim, from Ayyub and from Nafi, and from Ibn Umar, he says, who said, let none of you say, I have acquired the whole of the Quran. How does he know what all of it is when much of the Quran has disappeared? Rather, let him say, I have acquired what has survived. Now, that's a huge admission right there. Sahih Muslim, second only to Bukhari as far as importance for the hadith writers, said, some of the verses were forgotten. I have, however, forgotten it with the exception of this which I remember, and he then recites what he remembers. So here you have Sahih Bukhari, the most authoritative of the hadith writers, talking about verses which were canceled. We used to read the verse of the Quran revealed in their connection, but later the verse was canceled, he said. Then you have Bukhari going on saying that something was missing. This is the verse of Rajam. This is the verse on stoning adulterers. Among what Allah revealed was the verse on Rajam, and we did recite this verse and understand and memorize it, and Allah's apostle did carry out the punishment of stoning, and so did we after him. I'm afraid that after a long time has passed, somebody will say, by Allah, we do not find the verse of Rajam in Allah's book, and that's true. To open up to chapter 24, verse 2, and you will not find stoning there. It's now 100 lashes. 100 lashes. Ibn Abi Dawud talks about some verses overlooked. Muwatta ibn Malik talks about some verses having been changed. By the way, that was interesting because it was changed by a woman, not by a man, but by a woman. Some verses were modified. Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf made 11 modifications. This is the same Al-Hajjaj that we talked about last night, who then created those qiblas in between. Remember, all the mosques that he was forming all had a qibla that was not to Petra, not to Mecca, but exactly in between. That's the same Al-Hajjaj, who made 11 modifications to the Quran. Some verses were substituted according to Sahih Bukhari, and some verses were eaten by sheep. The verse of stoning and of breastfeeding an adult 10 times was revealed, and the paper was with me, was put under my pillow, but when the messenger of Allah died, we were preoccupied with his death, and a tame sheep came and ate it. So, what do we see here? Lost, disappeared, forgotten, canceled, missing, overlooked, changed, modified, substituted, eaten by sheep. Does this sound like a book which was compiled perfectly and completely? Does this not imply intentional human intervention right through its initial compilation? So there's a disconnect between that which the earliest scholars are saying and what the scholars today are saying. And that's why we now need to look at some of these inaccuracies. Let's take a look at some of the historical inaccuracies or anachronisms there in the Quran. When you open the Quran, you will see in chapter 20, verse 85 to 87, and then also 95 to 97, that when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, a Samaritan builds the golden calf. And it's very clear that this was a Samaritan because Moses said to him, and what is your case, O Samaritan? The problem is there were no Samaritans in 1400 BC. Samaritans were not created until the fall of the northern kingdom by Israel, by Sargon II. And that was in 722 BC. So how can you have Samaritans existing 700 years earlier? It gets a mosque much too early. Remember, we talked about this mosque last night. That's the Dome of the Rock, and there's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. One was built in 691. The other was built in 710. In chapter 17, verse 1 of the Quran, it talks about the Masjid al-Haram and the Masjid al-Aqsa, but it talks about from the great mosque to the farthest mosque, assuming that therefore that is referring to the Miraj that I referred to last night, where Muhammad went from Mecca up to Jerusalem. The farthest mosque would be in Jerusalem. The difficulty is there were no Muslims in Jerusalem. Muslims didn't get to Jerusalem until at least what do I have here? 649 to 650. So you see that already they've got Muslims in the wrong place doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. It cannot be the temple they're referring to because that was destroyed in 70 AD. In chapter 34, verse 10 to 11 of the Quran, it talks about David and that he was to make full coats of mail and circulate precisely the links, meaning chain mail. Yet David lived in 1000 BC. There was no chain mail. They didn't have that technology in 1000 BC. Coats of chain mail were not invented until 200 BC, 800 years later. It misplaces crucifixions too early. In the story of Pharaoh and Moses, the sorcerers who could not keep up with with Moses, they were taken out and they were crucified. That's in 1400 BC. You see that in Surah 7, ayah 120 to 124, and in chapter 20, verse 71. In the story of Joseph, which is in 1800 BC, again, a Pharaoh takes the baker and crucifies him. You can't have crucifixions that early, because crucifixions were not introduced until 500 BC. They were not ever used in Egypt as well. Thus, the Quran's crucifixions are in the wrong place, and they're about 1,000 to 1,300 years too early. Now, the one place it should have got the crucifixion right, it gets it wrong. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He was not crucified according to Surah 4, ayah 157. Yet when you take a look at all the historical material from the first century, look at the historians who would refer to that crucifixion. You have Thallus and Phlegon who are debating it in 52 AD, just 20 years after the event. You have Tacitus who hated Christians. He was talking about it. Even he is the one that tells it happened during the time of Pontius Pilate, while Tiberius was emperor, proving that it had to happen in 33 AD. That's why we get the date for the crucifixion. He was a Roman historian. Josephus, a Jewish historian, talks about the crucifixion, mentions not only that Jesus was crucified, but then it goes on to say that the Christians believe he rose again. So there is a Greek historian, Roman historian, and Jewish historian all talking about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Why did the Quran get it so wrong? And it's got the wrong Mary. In chapter 19, verse 28, it says, Mary, you have certainly done a thing unprecedented, O sister of Aaron. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, is the sister of Aaron. In chapter 66, verse 12, the same Mary who is the mother of Jesus is the daughter of Imran, who is the father of Aaron. And in chapter 20, verse 30, Aaron has a brother named Moses. So both Aaron and Moses, who are the sons of Imran, which is the biblical Amran, have a sister named Miriam, who is the mother of Jesus. Do you see a problem with that? Especially when you know that Aaron and Moses did have a sister named Miriam. They were all three the children of Amram, but they lived in 1400 BC. Mary lived in the first century, unless she was a very old Mary. And it confuses the Qibla and the Kaaba. We saw that last night, so we won't reiterate that over again. It gets the wrong Qibla at the wrong place, finally gets the right Qibla for Mecca, not till 727, and finally was not made solidified until the 800s. And then today, now you'll see them all towards Mecca. It also completely confuses where the Kaaba is and does not understand that the Kaaba, it can be any place where their worship is done in many different sanctuaries. It confuses Pharaoh, the Tower of Babel, and Haman in chapter 28, verse 38, mentioning that Haman is an Egyptian. Chapter 40, verse 36 to 37, Pharaoh talks to Haman. The problem is Egypt never built any towers, as according to this story. They built pyramids. More than that, we know that Haman was not an Egyptian name. It is a Persian name, and we see him referred to in the story of Esther in chapter 3, verse 1. Pharaoh lived in 1500 BC, whereas Haman, the Persian Haman, lived in 510 BC. They never met each other because there was about 1,000 years between them. Now, God would not make these kind of mistakes, man would. That's why I'm pointing these out to you, proving that this is all man-made. And the error we do not put at God's feet. It makes Alexander the Great an amazing engineer. In chapter 18, verse 96, it talks about Alexander creating a wall between two mountains to keep the barbarians from getting across. This great big wall that is big enough to hold down an entire army is made out of iron and copper. Now, Alexander lived in the 3rd century BC. That would be one of the greatest engineering events of history, to say nothing of the fact that we can't even make those large walls of iron and copper even today. One of the greatest engineering feats, according to the Quran, by Alexander the Great. We have 3 biographies of Alexander. Nowhere is there any reference to this wall. And where would its residue be? And then it refers to futuristic coins. We showed these on the wall, but I didn't unpack them for you. Remember, it said that Joseph was sold for a few dirham counted out. Counted out means coins, am I correct? If you're counting out, there must be coins. There were no coins at the time of Joseph in 1800 BC. Coins were not invented until the 600s by the Lydians. So what coins existed at the time of Joseph, 1800 BC? And obviously, this was written long before coins. Well, this was written long after coins were made and redacted back to the wrong person doing the wrong thing. Now, what about the Bible? Does the Bible get this wrong? When you look at Genesis 37:28, it says that Joseph is sold for 20 shekels. A shekel is a weighted measure. 20 shekels is about 0.2% of silver. When you look at the Nuzi tablets and the Mari tablets, you will see that the price of a slave exactly fits what we see in Genesis 37. We don't ask it to be correct, it just turns out to be correct. But I'm still curious about that dirham. Because dirham is a specific coin. It's the name of a coin. Did you remember last night, when were the dirhams introduced? They were introduced in 661. There were no dirhams before 661 because all the Arabs would have used drachmas, either Greek drachmas or Byzantine drachmas. They took the drachmas and then they introduced their own coins in 661. Remember, they took the emperor's image off and put the caliph's image instead? You saw those last night? Which means there could be no dirhams before 661. So how could they be in a Quran referred to by a man who died in 632? That's 30 years too early. Ooh, I love that. Unless, of course, Muhammad was prophetic. So when you look at these anachronisms, what we notice is the authors of the Quran do not seem to know history very well. God would not make these kind of mistakes. Man would. This is further proof that the Quran includes intentional human interventions. So what about where the Quran came from? Let's now investigate the sources of the Quran. You need to look at the stories. When you look at the stories in the Quran, you will notice that lots of the stories have biblical characters, but they don't have the same stories that are in our Bible. And you will see this over and over and over again. The Quran, they claim, is the eternal word of God. It comes from preserved tablets in heaven. It was revealed to correct the errors of previous revelations. It is unfettered by human intervention, they say. It does not come from man, but from God. Yet, just how eternal is it? If we can find even one previous human source, then all of the above can be disproven. So, let's see what we find. And what we find is this. These stories, when you look at them, all either borrowed from Jewish apocryphal writing or from Christian sectarian writing, and in another case, they come from Zoroastrian sources. Let me give you some examples. Here's one right here, Cain and Abel in chapter 5, verse 31. When you go up in chapter 5, verse 31 of the Quran, you see Cain kills his brother Abel, doesn't know what to do with the body, and so he sees a raven burying its partner, so he follows the example of the raven. Is that in your Bible? No, for one very good reason. That was never written while the Bible existed. It was written long after the Bible was canonized in the 2nd century. It comes from the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, a Jewish scribe who was just doing this basically for fun. He didn't even consider it to be authoritative. The very next verse then talks about the blood of Abel, and it's fascinating because it talks about the children of Israel and mentions that he who takes the blood of one, referring to the blood of Abel, is if he takes the blood of all, but he who saves the blood of one is if he saves the blood of all. Have you heard that verse before? You will if you listen to your politicians, because all the politicians love that verse. proving that the Quran is a book of peace. Don't take the blood of one because you take the blood of all. Save the blood of one because you save the blood of all. What they didn't realize, look at the beginning of that verse. O children of Israel. This has nothing to do with Muslims. What's more, this verse was actually included in the Bar Sanhedrin in the 5th century. It was fascinating because at the beginning of the 5th century, the scribe who was writing the Bar Sanhedrin took the story of Jonathan ben Uzziah about Cain and Abel, incorporated it into the text, and then he started writing in the margin in his own pen about the blood of Abel. He who takes the blood of one, he takes the blood of all. He who saves the blood of one, as if he saves the blood of all. Now, in the late 5th century, when the Bar Sanhedrin was being officially copied down, the story of Cain and Abel from Jonathan ben Uzziah, along with a scribal account, writing in the margin, is incorporated into the same story in the Bar Sanhedrin chapter 4, verse 5. That then makes its way into the Quran sometime in the 8th century. What's interesting, if you want to look at that, you need to say that's only for the Jews. So what is the verse they should have looked at? What's the verse that's for Muslims? The very next verse, verse 33. He who stands against Allah and his prophet Muhammad shall be crucified and have their hands and feet cut off from opposite ends. That's the verse they should have been reading. Now tell me if that's a verse of peace. When you get to Abraham and the Kaaba, you notice that Abraham, according to the Quran, lives in Mecca. I had no idea he lived in Mecca, but according to the Quran, that's where he lived. And he gets up in the middle of the night, and he goes into the Kaaba, that square building, he takes a large idol and destroys all the smaller idols. The next morning, the people see what happened. They get angry. They grab him. They arrest him. They ask him what he's done. He said, well, talk to the big idol. He blamed it on the big idol. They can't talk to the idol, so they take him and they throw him into a fiery pit. That's in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71. That same story comes from the Mishnah Rabbah, written in the 2nd century again. It's another Jewish fable, never considered to be authoritative, and yet it finds its way into the Quran sometime in the 8th century. And my favorite one is chapter 27, verse 17 to 44. This is the story of Solomon and Sheba, and this is the story I must have missed in Sunday school, because this story is a lot more exciting. According to the Quran, Solomon was marching his birds, getting them ready for battle, and they would fly up over the enemy, and they would drop a stone onto the enemy with the name of the enemy they're going to kill on the bottom. The first Air Force ever invented, Solomon. Did you know that? One day, as he's marching his bird, getting them ready for battle, he notices that the one bird, the hoopoe bird, his favorite bird, is missing. And he gets angry, and then he sees it flying in from the south and lands at his feet and talks to him. Lo and behold, Solomon can talk to birds. He asks him where he's been. He says, I've been down in the south. There's a gorgeous queen in the land of Sheba. You've got to go see her. He says, I'm way too busy. Why don't you fly on back down and bring her up? So he does that, flaps on back down to Sheba, lands at the foot of the queen of Sheba, talks to her. Lo and behold, she talked to birds. Why can't we do that today? Because we don't read the Quran. So she comes up with the bird up to the throne room where Solomon is sitting on his throne. She comes in the door of the throne. As she's about to cross to meet him, she sees a pond in the middle of the floor, and she pulls up her skirts to keep them from getting wet. And that's where it ends in verse 44. How many have heard this story before? In your Bible? Not in your Bible. So where have you heard it? Okay. Do you know the source for this? This is right up there on the screen. Just look. Second Targum of Esther. This is a well-known account. Almost exactly the same story that's in the Quran you will find in the Second Targum of Esther, except for the very end. At the very end of the Second Targum of Esther, as she's crossing and as she pulls up her skirts, she has hairy legs. When Solomon sees the hairy legs, he cries out in surprise. That is kept out of the Quran for obvious reasons. When you look at Mary and Imran and Zachariah in Surah 3, ayah 35 to 37, you will see that story also comes in the Proto-Evangelions, James the Lesser. When you look at Jesus in the palm tree, where he demands that the palm tree bow down to feed his mother in chapter 19, that comes straight out of the lost books of the Bible. Again, another sectarian account from the 2nd century. These are Christian sectarian accounts. They were all Gnostic accounts. When Jesus talks, or Isa talks from the cradle, you will see that that is found in the first gospel, the infancy of Jesus Christ, another 2nd century account. Again, all of these are Gnostic accounts. The one where in chapter 3, verse 49, where he takes some clay and then molds them into birds, blows on them, they fly up into the air. That comes right out of the Thomas Gospel, the infancy of Jesus Christ. These are all sectarian accounts. They are all Gnostic. Fascinating enough, they were all written in Syriac. And when you write it in Syriac, and if you borrow the story from Syriac, you not only borrow the story, you also borrow the name. And the name for Jesus in Syriac is Iesu. When you take it into Arab, it becomes Issa. That's why Issa is the wrong name for Jesus, because it is not the Arabic name for Jesus. If you look at the Sinaiticus, Codex Sinaiticus 151, which is the oldest New Testament Arabic Bible, the oldest Bible of the New Testament, written in 868. It's in St. Catherine's Monastery. That's the earliest, the earliest translation of the New Testament into Arabic. Look at the name for Jesus in that text. His name is Yeshua, not Issa. Issa is introduced in the Quran. Fascinating, isn't it? They've got the wrong name, they've got the wrong man, they've got the wrong stories. Be careful what you borrow. Here are some other examples. Not all of these are Christian or Jewish accounts. You will see that some of these are also Zoroastrian. You can see a good 30%, some say maybe as much as 50 to 60% of the Quran has been borrowed from other sources. And that's why when we're looking at it today, you can see that the reason they had to borrow was because both the Old and the New Testament of the Bible had never been written in Arabic, were not written in Arabic in the 7th century. Therefore, if they were putting the Quran together in the 7th century up until the 8th century, they did not have available to them our Bible. That's why they had to use these other accounts. Many of them, they were quite well known because these were the Christians and the Jews who were in the diaspora. They had come and they were trading with the Arabs. As they traded, they heard these stories recounted around bonfires, and many of these stories were then incorporated into the Quran because they were recounted in the vernacular. They were recounted so that the Arabs could understand them. But they got the wrong stories. That's what I've just said. I should have had the slide up as I was saying. Sorry about that. Many of these stories would have then been embellished, and others would be used as bedtime tales for Jewish children. The authentic Old Testament was never translated into Arabic until the 8th century, and the New Testament until 9th century, 868 to be exact. Thus much too late to make it into the Quran. Now, what about the two compilations? Now, to understand how the Quran was put together, you need to go to the Hadith, and you need to go specifically to Al-Bukhari. Al-Bukhari is the one that recounts it the best. And when you go to Al-Bukhari, you need to go to volume 6, Hadith number 509 and 510. There's 509 up on the screen there. You can see it in the Arabic on the right, and you can see the English translation. It's too long. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Let me just summarize what it says. According to what Al-Bukhari says. Now remember, Al-Bukhari is writing in 870. So this is the late 9th century, writing for that which has happened in 632 to 634. So he's writing about what is happening immediately after Muhammad dies. Muhammad dies in 632. The Quran had not yet been written down. And so Abu Bakr, who is the caliph, along with Umar, who will be the eventual caliph, the two of them have a crisis on their hands. Because many of those who went to the battle in Yamama were killed, and many of those who were killed had memorized the Quran. So they were losing those who had memorized the Quran. And they needed to do something about it, to preserve the Quran. So they called Zayd ibn Thabit. Now, Zayd ibn Thabit is the secretary of Muhammad. They call him in to write the Quran. And he says, no, I can't do something that the Prophet had not done. So they say, nonetheless, it's a good thing to do. So he decides to go ahead and do that. And he collects it from palm leaves and white stones and from men's memory. And then one verse, chapter 9, verse 128 to 29, he found with only one man named Abi Khuzaimah al-Ansari. So this is known as the first recension. This is the first copy, the first canon of the Quran, written somewhere between 632 and 634, okay? Are you following that? This is Quran number 1. According to tradition, not according to Al-Bukhari, that Quran then is given to Hafsa, one of the wives of Muhammad, and she puts it under her bed and leaves it there. Roughly 20 years later, then we get to volume 6, hadith number 510, the very next page. So we've jumped 20 years. Now we're roughly around 652. Are you following me? We were in 632, now we're in 652. In 652, Uthman now is caliph. Abu Bakr and Umar have both died. Uthman has another crisis on his hand. And he calls Zayd ibn Thabit, the secretary of Muhammad, once again, a second time, to rewrite the Quran, which was given to Hafsa, to take Hafsa's Quran, that original one, and to rewrite it. And he was given 3 men to help him out: Alas, Zubair, and Hisham. The 4 of them were then to rewrite it again, and if they had any disagreement, they were to write it in the Qurayshi dialect. Now, does anybody here speak Arabic or read or write Arabic? Okay, what's wrong with that right there? What is wrong? How do you write it in a Qurayshi dialect? What's a dialect? How do you find dialectical differences in an Arabic text? Okay, but how do you write it down differently? Hearing, yes, but how would you write what you hear is different. So if you were from Iraq, you have one dialect. If you're from Morocco, you would have another dialect. Am I correct? 2 different dialects. How would you then write that so people could see that it's different? What would you need for that to happen? Okay, let me rephrase this. What is it that you recognize in the text that creates the dialect? You need the dhamma, the kasra, and the fatha. Am I correct? The vowels. Because these are all vowels difference. And you also need diacritical marks, the dottings. Am I correct? Were there any dots, for those of you who speak Arabic, were there any dots in the 7th century? No. Dots were not invented till the 8th century. We're going to see that a little later. Were there any vowels in the 7th century? So how in the world does this make any sense to you? Why has no one noticed this before? We've noticed it. Al-Fadi, who I work with from Saudi Arabia, who's doing his doctorate in this area, has noticed it because he speaks fluent Arabic and he understands exactly the problem with this. He says you cannot have dialectical differences in a written text in the 7th century. But then who's writing this? Al-Bukhari is writing this, and he's writing this in 870. That's the late 9th century. In the 9th century, that makes sense. He's just writing what he thought was the problem, and he's redacting it back onto an era that he didn't even understand because he did not look at the earliest manuscripts. None of the earliest manuscripts have any dots, and they don't have any vowelization. Now, that's just for you two, okay? For the rest of you who have no idea what I've just said, don't worry, you'll get it as we go on. Now, here's what's fascinating. According to 510, once they had written this final text in the Qurayshi dialect, which is impossible to use, they then take one copy and send it to every province. So how many provinces existed at the time of Uthman in 652? 9 provinces. I'll show you that a little later. And when you look at those 9 provinces, you will see that means there should be 9 original Qurans in existence today. When I was doing my master's and my doctoral material on this, I was always told it was only 4. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, and Medina. But it looks like there were 9 of these. Why hadn't anybody noticed this before? And then all the other manuscripts that existed that disagreed with this final text were burnt. Why would you burn manuscripts, folks? Unless, of course, they disagreed. And unless, of course, you want to destroy the evidence. Ask your Muslim friends, why in the world did Uthman burn all the other manuscripts? It's right there in Al-Bukhari. They can't walk away from this. They cannot. I've yet to, in 35 years of asking this question, I've heard a Muslim that can really give me an answer to that. So here are my problems, and these are the problems I have with those 2 first compilations, one in 632 and the one in 652. Concerning, let's start with the one in 632, 6509. First and foremost, my first question is, why in the world, if God in his wisdom was going to give the final revelation that's going to supersede all the previous revelations, why in the world did he use a language that could not even accommodate it? When he already had Hebrew and Greek in his earliest revelations, why in the world does he turn around and use a completely new language which had no diacritical marks, had no vowelization? You can't even read it or understand it. Why in the world would he choose that? Secondly, why would he give his greatest revelation in the history of mankind to a man who couldn't even read and write? Listen, Muhammad, though he knew Arabic quite well, he was his native tongue, he had 22 years to read and write it. Those of you who know Arabic, there are only 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet. You're going to see them later tonight. I learned the Arabic alphabet in 2 weeks. I didn't know how to speak Arabic, but Muhammad did. Why in 22 years could he not learn to read and write? What's more, he had a secretary, Zayd ibn Thabit. What was the job of a secretary if it is not to write down what the master is saying? Am I correct? So why didn't Zayd ibn Thabit write this down? He had 22 years to do so. Then why did Abu Bakr not make copies immediately of Hafsa's text? Let's continue on. Muslims said that thousands died at the Battle of Yamama. According to the traditions, there was only 70 that died at the Battle of Yamama. Doesn't this prove that there were very few who actually knew the Quran at that time, if only 70 knew it? Doesn't this also prove that there was a real crisis with the Quran? Because if this was the case, if this was such a crisis that with 70 dying, then when I hear Muslims say it didn't matter if they were all killed because people had memorized it, obviously this was a much greater problem. The fact that they had to write it down means they could not trust people's memory. And I can understand that because I don't trust people's memory today. Yeah. That's both in Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. You can find it in both two sources. So this proves to me that memorization wasn't good enough to preserve the Quran. When Muslims tell me that all the time, I just point them right back to the Battle of Yamama and say, you've got a problem here, because Abu Bakr and Umar realized that they needed to write it down. When we get to 510 then, how could there be dialectical differences in the mid-7th century? Because in order to have dialectical differences, you have to have vowelization. You have to have diacritical marks. They didn't even exist. They were yet to exist for 100 years, and the vowelization would not to exist for another 200 years. And then why in the world did Uthman burn it, for heaven's sakes? Doesn't this suggest that they didn't agree? Why didn't he preserve so we can look and see which ones they did disagree, so we can see where the disagreements were? Then let's look at the 9 cities, and here they are. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, Aden, Herat, and Nishapur. Went too fast. Those are the 9 cities. Now take a look at those 9 cities. Except for Jerusalem, all of those 9 cities still exist under Islamic control. Am I correct? And for 1,400 years, they have been under Islamic control. I don't recall of any floods. I don't recall of any damage. I don't recall of any conquest. I don't recall of any fires that would have destroyed those manuscripts. So why is it that if they were sent to 9 different cities, why is it we can't find one of those 9 earliest manuscripts? Not one. Not one exists today. Either that's ineptitude on a grand scale, or they never existed to begin with. I think after tonight, you'll see it's the latter. But let's continue on. Number 6, the fact that Zayd ibn Thabit came up with Surah 33:23 with just one man, Khuzaymah ibn Thabit al-Ansari, proves the Quran wasn't even complete in 632. Could there have been many other surahs that he missed? What about the material which was lost with those killed in the Battle of Yamama? If there was a second Quran in 652, why now do we have up to at least 32 Qurans in existence today, all in Arabic? What about the earliest extant manuscripts, which do exist? Should we not take a look at them to find out just how similar they are to our present Hafs text? So I'm not going to do too much on the 6 earliest manuscripts because I've done an awful lot. It's all up on Fander Films. These are the manuscripts that I debated with Dr. Shabir Ali back in 2014. And many of you have seen that. If you haven't seen it, just go up. The great debate, the classic debate, Jay Smith versus Shabir Ali. It was on September of 2014, so we're talking about 5 years ago. And at that debate, I introduced these 6 manuscripts. I had just been given access to them because of the 2 Turkish scholars, Dr. Tahir Atakuluc and Dr. Ekmelen Selanu, who had spent 5 years from 2002 to 2007 studying these 6 manuscripts. They came out with a report in 2009. It was translated into English in 2013. I got a hold of it, and that's why I challenged Shabir Ali to this debate. Over 500,000 people have watched that debate on YouTube. We know of hundreds who have given their life to Jesus Christ because of that one debate. That's why debates are important. Debates is the only place where we can actually get this material out into the public sphere and force Muslims to answer it. His only response is he didn't care about these manuscript variants. You'll hear more about them tonight. He didn't really care about the fact that none of them, not one of these manuscripts, is from the 7th century. They're from the 8th century. Not one of them is complete. Every one of them has manuscript variants. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of manuscript variants. That means words and phrases that are different in these manuscripts than what we have in our hand today. And these are the 6 major manuscripts. The Topkapi, which is in the Topkapi Museum there in Istanbul. You can go to the Topkapi Palace and see it on Ramadan. That's the only time they show it to the public. This is the best one they've got. About 99% of the Quran is included in this text, but only about 78% is readable because there's been so much water damage. That is the text that is dated to anywhere from the second half of the 1st century AH to the first half of the 2nd century AH. You will hear Muslims say this all the time. Basically what they're saying is the early 8th century. So this is dated because parts of it are dated after 719. So well into the 8th century, this was written. The one next to it is the Samarkand. That's in Tashkent. That only goes up to Surah 43. And even then, it's not complete. In fact, it only has one surah that's complete amongst the 43. 6 of them don't even exist amongst the first 43. So much of it is missing. It is so full of errors. It has so many grammatical mistakes that both Altakulic and Ekmel al-Nasano say don't even use it. It's an embarrassment. The Ma'il manuscript, which is here in London, that also goes up to Surah 43. We're now just looking at it. We've had access to it. The dating on that is anywhere from the early 8th century to the late 8th century. Martin Lings dated to 790. It was then brought back to the late 7th century. I got on the phone, and after 10 minutes of talking to the man who changed the date, he put it back up to the 8th century, just from a 10-minute phone call, and he didn't even know who I was. I never gave my name. The Petropolitanus manuscript on the right is from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. François Doroche has done the most work on it. It only includes 25% of the Quran. In that 25%, it has 93 manuscript variants. The Husseini manuscript on the left is probably some have claimed it's 8th century. Many scholars today say it's a 9th century manuscript. It is probably the one that's riddled with coverings. We're going to talk more about that tonight. And then the most exciting one is the Sana'a manuscripts, discovered in 1975. German scholars, Gerd Prinn, Dr. von Botham, Dr. Oleg, were flown down in 1981 to look at that manuscript, and when they looked at it, they realized that they were looking at a real treasure trove. Because as you can see, it has no diacritical marks, it has no vowelization. If you look on the right side, you will see Surah 19 coming down to that yellow mark, and then it jumps to Surah 22. What happened to Surah 20 and 21? It begins to appear on the left side in a completely different script. Every time you see one of those orange marks, that's a manuscript variant. And because of that, you can see why this one is so exciting. But what they have found is that this one also has a subtext. It has a undertext. It's known as a palimpsest. What tends to happen with these animal skins, because they are written on animal skins, if you make mistakes and if you want to change the text, you can just wash it off and then write over top. And when you wash it off, there's nothing to see. What they don't realize is that hundreds of years later, the ink starts to bleed through. So that today, we can now see the undertext of the Sana'a manuscript. I'll be talking about that in just a bit. When we look at all the 6 early Quranic manuscripts, we find that none of them are from the 7th century. They are not complete. None of them are complete. None of them completely agree with each other, and none of them completely agree with the current 1924 Hafs text. All of them have hundreds and even thousands of subsequent manuscript variants. The Topkapi alone has 2,290 manuscript variants from the Quran that I have in my hand today. 2,290 manuscript variants. And yet that's the best manuscript they have. So when was there a complete Quran? Well, before we go into that, let's just look at that Sana'a manuscript, because this is what's curious and is what's exciting. When you look at the undertext, can you see the bleeding through that's coming over here on the right? The blue one, that's looking with ultraviolet light. You can see the lower text. They've been able to separate the two texts. And Dr. Asma Hilali came out with her book in 2017 where she did a summary of the lower and upper text. And what she found, well, not just herself, Sadeghi and Gudarzi have also looked at it. So have Dr. Elizabeth Prinn, the wife of Dr. Gerd Prinn. She has done a whole study on it. They came up with different positions. What they did find were 63 verses in the lower text. Amongst the 63 verses, they found 70 variants. That means words that did not agree with the Quran, even above the upper text, but even of the Quran we have today. There were 25 times there were verbs and nouns that didn't agree. There were articles, participles, conjunctions, prepositions, isolated letters, 29 times where there were different expressions. Entire sentences, 16 times were different. Now, Asmad Halali explained this as a school text. What she was saying is this: the reason why you all have all these variants in the lower text is because this is what students were writing, and therefore what we're looking at is nothing more than some students who are making a lot of errors. Dr. Elizabeth Quinn confronts that notion for two very good reasons. She said, first of all, why would you allow students to be writing on parchment? This is very valuable material. These are animal skins. You do not give that to students. You can give them papyrus, yes, but you don't give them vellum. Secondly, why would you then preserve that script, that manuscript, and that is the oldest? And why is it that this is the oldest script that we can come across? This is the one script that we could say is from the 7th century. What is interesting is that the script that is there looks like it, and her conclusion is, looks like this was a nascent Quran, a beginning of a Quran that had to then finally be, they finally just raced it off, washed it off, and wrote over top. Now, that's still that's still up to an awful lot of questions. We're not going to come to a conclusion on that. But back in 2015, a new Quran came, or not a Quran, but just 2 folios were all over the news. Do you remember this? On July 22nd, BBC had it front and center, this new Quran that has been found in the Birmingham Library called the Birmingham Folios. Dr. David Thomas, who is responsible for this manuscript, had sent it down, well, actually it wasn't here, it was Abda Fadeli, had sent it down to Oxford University to have it carbon dated at Oxford University. And they carbon dated it between 568 and 645. Remember, carbon dating is very, very inexact. So it's almost a 100-year span that the carbon dating exists. Now, Dr. David Thomas, of course, hearing this, said the writer of this manuscript could well have known the Prophet Muhammad. He would have seen him probably. He would maybe have heard him preach. He may have known him personally, and that really is quite a thought to conjure with. Now, the problem is many of the Muslim scholars kept quiet. Can you see why they kept quiet? If those dates are correct, and I'm going to say if those dates are correct, then you can see immediately 645 is too early, because how can you have a manuscript that exists prior to the Uthmanic recension? That's 7 years too early, if even that latest date is the correct date. What's more likely is that these probably are much earlier manuscripts that have stories, because they do include Surah 18, Surah 19, and Surah 20. Take a look at those 3 stories. The 7 sleepers in Surah 18, the story of Proto-Evangelium of James, the Pseudo-Gospel of Matthew is found in Surah 19, and the story of Moses from the Bible is found in Surah 20. All of these would have been borrowed from other sources. But if you're going to go with those dates and you do trust carbon dating, then you're going to have to deal with these laboratory results that are now coming out in 4 different labs here with the Sana manuscript here in Europe. The labs are Lyon in France, Kiel in Germany, Zurich in Switzerland, and the Oxford lab that we were talking about earlier. Take a look at the Sana manuscript from these 4 labs over here on the left. Look at the dates that they have now dated the Sana manuscript using carbon dating. Taken from these 4 European labs, note that all Sana manuscripts are between 390 and 550. That means that they would predate not only Muhammad, they would also predate Islam, and they'd certainly predate the Quran. Are you going to go with those dates? If you want to go with those dates, fine, but that means most of the Quran, certainly that exists in the Sana manuscripts, all predate Islam by a good 100 years. Dr. Mark Duthie has probably said the best. He says these 4 Sana examples prove that the dated, since they're so early, that they are all more than likely, if you're going to go with this date, they are long before even Muhammad or the Quran came into existence. The best thing to do is be careful of carbon dating. It's too inexact. I wouldn't go with it. I would go with paleographical dating, and I would go with chronological dating. That's probably much more accurate. Now let's get to the diacritical variants, and these are probably the ones that caused the Muslims the most anger when we introduced them 3 years ago here in London. What do we mean by diacritical variants? Except for 2 of you, the rest of you don't know what I'm talking about. So let's help you and unpack it so we can see what's going on. Take a look at those two manuscripts. Can you notice there's no dots above and below the lines, right? That is straight Razm consonantal text. The consonantal text is what is known as Razm in Arabic. That's the Samarkand manuscript, which is in Tashkent. Over here is the Sana manuscript, which is in Yemen. Both of these are 8th century documents. And you can see there's no vowels, there's no curlicue for the dhamma, there's no line at the top for the fatta, and there's no line below for the kasra, the u, the a, and the e sound. There's 3 vowels in Arabic with the long vowels as well. That's why when you look at these, how do you know what you're reading? You can't read it, and that's why from the very beginning you can see it's a very inexact text. So in Arabic, as I said earlier, there are 28 letters. But 6 of the letters are unique. The Aleph, the Kaf, the Lam, the Mim, the Ha, and the Waw. Those are the 6 letters that don't need any dots. They always remain the same regardless of where they're found in the word. The other 22 all need dots. What do I mean by that? Well, take a look at that smiley face. One smiley face. You put 1 dot above it, it's a nun. 2 dots above it, it becomes a ta. 3 dots above it, it becomes a tha. That same smiley face, if you put 1 dot below it, becomes a ba. 2 dots below it, it becomes a ya. Which means you can get 5 different letters with just 1 smiley face. Na, ta, tha, ba, ya. Can you see the dilemma? How, therefore, can you read when Arabic unless you have the dots? If you put 3 of those smiley faces together, one after another, you can get 19 different words depending on where you put the dots. Now, Al-Fadi says he can actually get 31 different words, but that's because he knows Arabic so much better than the rest of us from Saudi Arabia. Why is that important? Well, this is where the Qira'at and Ahruf come into being. Does anybody know what I'm talking about when I say Qira'at and Ahruf? These are the diacritical differences. Because of the fact that there are so many diacritic possibilities to put those dots in anywhere, you can imagine that there's going to be whole schools of differences depending on what reading you're going to give. And when you hear about the readings, they're talking about this. So in the 8th and 9th century, you had different schools that were creating completely different Qurans with different readings, and here they are. These are just 26 of the 32 we now have here in London. We've gone around the world and we've now found them. Hatun Tash is the one that's done this. Hatun Tash on my team. She has found them in Morocco. She's found them in Jordan. She's found them in Yemen. Just those 3 countries. She's come up with now, it's 32. Well, I'm even behind times. Now, every one of these are students. These are students of the Quran that come from 5 different cities. Those are the 5 cities: Mecca, Medina, Damascus, Kufa, and Basra. These 5 cities in the 9th and 10th century especially, late 8th century, 9th and 10th century, they were coming up with so many different variations of the Quran depending on where the dots were, that they each had their own Quran, and they each started their own schools. And if you look at these brown areas, these brown clouded areas, you can see Al-Bazi there had 1,054 differences from the Quran that we use today. Qalum had 1,700 differences. Hisham had 1,300 differences. Come on down to Abu al-Harith, and he had 5,000 differences. We have just looked at 23 of these Qurans, and we've already found 93,000 differences. Just by looking at 23. These are all Arabic Qurans. The differences are all in the diacritical marks and in the vowelization, but primarily the diacritical marks. And that's why when Muslims are talking about this, usually when they're talking about different Qurans, they're talking about the Qira'ats. And what most Muslims will say, these are all the same. The problem is there is one that was chosen because since there's so many differences, they had to come up with one canonical version, and they came up with this man right here, Hafs. Hafs is the one that was chosen, but look when he died, 796. So he died in the late 8th century. His Quran is 144 years after Muhammad. Does that bother any of you? It gets worse. Let's continue on. When you look at the examples of these variants, most Muslims will say they don't make any difference, and they'll usually use this example. This is the one they always use in chapter 1, verse 4, where on the side, Hafs here, you have Maliki, the owner of the day, versus Maliki, which is the king. Well, it could be the only owner of the day, or it could be the king of the day of recompense. The king is the owner, so therefore there's no difference. On face value, I would agree. But that's not what we're finding in other ones. Here's another one in chapter 3, verse 146. You have Katala on the left, and over here with Warsh, which is very popular in northern Africa, you have Kutila, were killed. So, and how many prophets fought versus and how many prophets were killed? Well, if I was a prophet, I would rather fight than be killed. So this would have a huge significance to me if I were one of them. Here you have another example, Surah 38, Ayah 45, where you have Ibadana, Dagger Aleph is added, and in this one there is no Dagger Aleph. It's the Abdana. Abdana, no Dagger Aleph. One is slaves, plural, the other is slave. And remember our slaves Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub. Well, obviously that should be a plural, so Hafs has it correct. Al-Bazi has slave, and yet he's talking about owners. So you can see it doesn't even agree with the subject. So you can see that there is a grammatical error built into that. Surah 43, Ayah 19, you have Ibadu on the left, you have Ra, Inda on the right. One says slaves on the left, the other says in the presence. So, and they make the angels who are slaves of the beneficent, or according to Ra, and they make angels who are in the presence of the beneficent females. Now, two problems. Are the angels slaves of Allah or simply in the presence of Allah? Number two, is it the slaves or those in Allah's presence who will be made females? If I were an angel, I would prefer being caught in God's presence rather than his slave. And if I were an angel being a male, I would prefer if only the slaves were made females, were not made females, thank you. So can you see, this does have theological differences, and each one of these could be a theological a treatise right there. Sorry, a PhD thesis. You can unpack these, and we have found 93,000 of these. I'm just showing you one or two, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Chapter 46, verse 15. Isanan, doing good, versus Al-Duri's rendition, which is Husnan, beauty. And we have joined on man doing good to his parents, versus, and we have enjoined on man beauty to his parents. Are men supposed to be good, or are we beautiful to our parents? As a parent, I have 3 sons. I would prefer my sons being good rather than just be good looking. 98 verse 6, Bareyati versus Al-Bare'ati. One is creatures, the other is the innocent. So here we're talking about polytheists who will be in hell, abiding eternally there, and those are the worst of creatures, versus on this side, the people of the scripture, that's us, the polytheists, will be in the fire of hell, abiding eternally there, and those are the worst of the innocent. So are we Christians the worst of creatures, or are we innocent? Well, I would prefer to go with Warsh on this one, because I'm a Christian. I would rather be innocent rather than being a polytheist in hell. Can you see how this has huge theological differences? So how can they say that this doesn't even change anything? But hold on a minute. Muslims have never been shown this. So we took these down, just 26 of these down. When was it, Sarah? Was it 2016, right? So 3 years ago. Were you there on the day? Oh, you missed it. I'm going to show you what happened when we took these down to Speaker's Corner.
There is only one Quran, right? And that every Quran in the world is the same. That's what you've been told. You have been told a lie. Okay, so there are 2 Qurans today, right? 2.
More than 2 Qurans.
More than 2, 3 Qurans?
More than 3 Qurans.
More than 3, 4
That's Hatun on the left.
There are approximately 26 of the Qurans.
26 different Qurans. You guys get these Qurans! Get these Qurans and read them! We're just showing you. Oh, go ahead, start throwing things out. It says they were lied to. They denied it. 2 different readings. That's the difference. Look, it was Papa and which has the Dhamma. The difference is between Papa and Dhamma. Read it. Read it again. The prophets fought, but by the time you get to the fight, they were killed. That is a huge
He's calling all the Muslims to leave now, so they can't hear what's happening.
You better go. They're going to make it more and more difficult for you.
Now, we almost did not leave the corner that afternoon. We were jumped on. They tried to grab the Qurans out of our hand. They would not leave the corner. I won't show you that video. the reason why they were so upset is because none of them had heard this before. None of them knew that there were different variants. And we're just talking about Kirat and Ahruf. This is not very damaging. Wait till you see what we're going to show you after the break.